class. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 10, The Far East, Ancient China from the Story of the World. In this video, we're going to review Chapter 10, talk about the Xia Dynasty and the Shang Dynasty. So let's start with your review. In Chapter 10.1, you read about Lei Zhu and the silkworm. The people of China lived between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, which you can see right here and right here with my amazing circling abilities. And you can also see all of the other ancient cultures we've been studying so far. Shang Di united the villages of the Yellow River Valley, and there are many legends about him. You read the story about Lei Zhu and the silkworm and how Shang Di was the first to invent medicine and things like that. In Chapter 10.2, the Pictograms of Ancient China, you learned a little bit about ancient Chinese people's lifestyle, how they grew rice, they raised silkworms, and they tried to defend themselves against invaders. The Shang Dynasty began in 1766 with Tang, who is pictured here, and his family ruled for more than 500 years. Also, during the Shang Dynasty, Chinese people started using bronze, and they used bronze to make weapons, wheels, and farming tools. And this is also when writing was invented. They used writing to engrave on bones and bronze plates, and they wrote using pictograms that you can see pictured here. And then in Chapter 10.3, you read about farming in ancient China, how most people in China were farmers. They had pigs, chickens, cows, they planted grains, and also rice. Rice can only grow where it's very wet, as you can see pictured here, and it couldn't grow in Mesopotamia or Egypt because it was too dry there. So this was something specific to China. Before we start with the rest of our video, I want to talk to you a little bit about this book. Susan Wise Bauer only has 3 chapters in here on ancient China, and it's very topical. So you learn about their writing, you learn about farming. Later on in like chapter 32, you're going to learn about their writing system again. You're going to learn about Confucius. And so she hits like some very like specific things, but doesn't really go chronologically. If you look at this book that I'm using a lot as a reference, you can see all of my sticky notes are right here, how there's just a lot of chapters on ancient China. So I'm going to try to do kind of an in-between. We won't be covering this much material because it would be overwhelming, and I want to do more than just hit certain topics in China because I think ancient Chinese culture is very fascinating. You guys know I'm half Japanese, and so Asian history is of interest to me. So we're going to try to go chronologically, but we're not going to go really in depth. We'll hit some of the more like main points, but that is what I'm going to attempt to do in these 3 chapters that we have. So let's get started. Okay, we're going to start with the Xia Dynasty from 2205 to 1766 BC. The Xia Dynasty is either looked at as myth or as truth. The Xia Dynasty is prehistory before the Shang Dynasty, and we define prehistory as a time before we have written records. So you have the Xia Dynasty, and there are a lot of oral traditions that come out of the Xia Dynasty, and it's written down thousands of years later. So because of that, the Xia Dynasty was believed to just be stories, myths, legends, until archaeologists discovered ruins of towns in the 1950s. However, it's still disputed. Are these actually from the Xia Dynasty? Is it a different people group? So the existence of this dynasty is still questioned. However, I think it's important to study because even if all of this is made up, ancient Chinese people still looked at this as part of their history, as their beginning, and they told stories about it. So it can tell us a lot about what they thought and what they believed and what their worldview was, which is really important. The first king of China is said to be Fu Xi, and he ruled in 2850 BC. So to just kind of give you a reference, Sargon conquered Mesopotamia in 3400 BC. Manu began his rule in 3205 BC, just so you kind of have some markers in your head. Susan Wise Bauer says Fu Xi invented the 8 trigrams, a pattern of straight and broken lines used for record keeping, divination, and interpretation of events. And you can see a picture here. The first Chinese king didn't save his people from a flood, like Manu, receive authority from heaven, like the Sumerians, or bring 2 countries into one, like Narmer. No, his great accomplishment was, for the Chinese, far more important. He found a connection between the world itself, between the patterns of nature and the impulse of the human mind to order everything around it. So already, again, even if this is myth, we are able to see their worldview and what they valued. Did they value strength and power in somebody who was able to unite their country? No, they valued someone who was a philosopher, someone who was able to figure out something about the universe and how it's connected to us, and how he discovered these patterns that tell us something, and how the Chinese people valued this wisdom over strength. And we'll see that again later. The third king is who you read about in the story of the world. His name was Shang Dynasty, also known as the Yellow Emperor. He ruled from 2696 to 2598 BC, and he conquers his brother, the Flame King, and he then spreads his rule over his brother's land. And this is when he just unites all of the Yellow River Valley. So we have talked about hereditary rule in Mesopotamia, how hereditary rule, where kings become kings based on birth and not something that they did or accomplished, was established in Mesopotamia, and how that created an aristocracy and how that created hierarchy. This hereditary rule was established in China, like Mesopotamia. However, they kind of have a twist on things, because there were these 3 kings that ruled during the Xia Dynasty who were called the 3 sage kings, and they all disinherit their sons, their lazy sons, and choose someone else to be king. Yao, who is pictured here, gives his throne to a poor but wise peasant. Can you imagine anyone in like Egypt or Mesopotamia doing that? To be like, hey, you are really, really poor. You have no money, no connections, nothing, but you're really smart and wise. Therefore, I'm going to choose you to be king over my own son. I can't imagine anyone in Mesopotamia or Egypt doing that, actually. Yu, the 3rd sage king, establishes then the Xia Dynasty. So the Xia Dynasty actually starts with Yu. But again, going back to talking about worldview and what they valued, you can see here that they valued not establishing your name, like Gilgamesh just wanted to be remembered and wanted to do all of these things. No, they valued this wisdom and valued leaving the throne to someone who was capable of ruling justly and wisely over giving their conquered area or their land to their own kid. Like, that's, again, even if this is myth, it still tells you something about how they viewed the world and what they valued. Susan Wise Bauer says, in China, the earliest tales of royal succession show not a desperate quest for a blood heir, but sons disinherited in favor of virtue. They celebrate kingly power while rejecting too heavy an exercise of it. Authority is all very well, but no man should assume that he'll automatically be gifted with it because of his birth. Wisdom, not birth, qualifies a man to rule. And it's interesting because we see a thread of this when you study the founding of America, and how instead of saying, hey, we don't want just a king who was born into this position, like someone who's just like, oh, your dad was a king and your grandpa was a king, so you automatically get to be a king. Instead, you know, they said, hey, let's elect someone based on qualifications instead of just someone who was born into that position. And we and you can just see this thread, and I just think that's interesting. However, the Xia dynasty does disintegrate into chaos. So the three sage kings disinherit their own sons, but soon sons begin taking power, and the Xia dynasty then begins to crumble. And this is a pattern that we're going to see over and over again in Chinese history. The last corrupt king was named Jie, and he was taken over by Tang, again pictured here. You read about him in your chapter. He begins the Shang Dynasty. So the Shang Dynasty lasted from 1766 to 1122 BC. And this is where we move from prehistory to history, because like you read, this is where we have the invention of writing. So the Encyclopedia Britannica gives us a definition of the Shang Dynasty. They say the Shang Dynasty is the first recorded Chinese dynasty for which there is documentary and archaeological evidence. The Shang Dynasty was the reputed successor to the quasi-legendary first dynasty, the Xia. So there were 29 or 30 kings in the Shang Dynasty, and it lasted for about 650 years. Something that's really interesting about the Shang Dynasty is that its capital moved 5 times in the first 350 years of the Shang Dynasty. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, what does this tell us about these kings and this dynasty? The first thing we can conclude is that the kings were probably still weak. They don't have enough authority or maybe manpower to hold on to their capital. Susan Wise Bauer says, the constant migration of the Shang capital city is puzzling. Every other ancient kingdom, so far as we know, tried to maintain a particular city as the capital. A capital was an important place, only deserting it in the face of hostile invasion or natural disaster. Instead of resisting, the Shang bent. Instead of taking up arms against opposition, they shifted and changed their ground and held China's throne for centuries. Eventually, the capital moved to Yin, which was the capital for the rest of the Shang Dynasty. I want you to think about what this tells you about the Shang Dynasty and their worldview, because moving capitals wasn't seen as running away. It was seen as a strength. It wasn't a weakness to bend and shift. It was seen as being wise. And I would have to agree with that assessment, because they were able to keep the throne for centuries simply by moving their government somewhere else. Again, I don't see this happening in the Akkadian Empire or the Assyrian Empire. I would see them, holding their ground and guarding their capital until they just got taken over. Whereas the Shang said, hey, it's not working. We don't have the manpower. Let's just go over here. And then let's just go over here. And they just kept doing that until they were well established enough to hold on to a capital. So pretty interesting in my opinion. Here are the 5 capitals. You can see them in red, and then the yellow dot is where the capital finally came rested, I guess. And then the green area is the Shang Dynasty. Now we're going to talk about bronze. Susan Wise Bauer says, the most famous Shang artifacts, vessels, weapons, beautifully turned farming tools, ornaments, are all those made of cast bronze. They stand as a testament to the Shang ruler's authority. Like pyramid building, the casting of bronze needed a king who could force multitudes of men to a nasty and labor-intensive job, in this case digging ore out of the mines that lay in the hilly country north of the Yellow River. No other ancient nation was able to cast bronze into such sophisticated items. So this tells us, bronze and casting bronze tells us about their culture, and you can't do stuff like this again without a surplus, without a thriving economy, without a king who has enough power to tell people to do this and to make these things. So here's some pictures. I think they look really cool. Moving on to writing. So their writing system was developed in the same way as in Mesopotamia. It was first used to mark ownership, and the writing system became more complex over time. Chinese writing developed organically in and of itself. Remember, this happened in Sumer, but the Egyptians learn about writing from the Sumerians. Chinese writing just developed. The difference in ancient Chinese writing is that the first signs were pictures, kind of like in Sumer, they were pictures, and then they turned into phonetic letters. In Egypt, they were pictures, and they stayed pictures for a while. However, the Chinese began to combine pictures, and this was called ideograms. And these combined pictures, these ideograms, represented abstraction and ideas. So I have this little chart for you. You may have seen this before, where people show you how these Chinese characters tell about the biblical account of creation and the flood. And so if you can see right here, this first one, you have walk, talk, living, dust, and man, and how, well, first you have living, dust, and man makes talk, and then talk plus walk equals create right here. Right here, the second one, you have dust, breathe, sorry, I'm not doing a good job of this, dust, breathe, enclosure, person, and another person, and how that is their symbol for garden. And these symbols are still used today. I write in Japanese, and a lot of their symbols are still similar to those, and so I recognize these. But you have vessel, ate, and mouth, and how that equals their word for boat. You have together, earth, and people. Oh, wait, together, earth, and ate, and that is total. Total plus water equals the flood. So this kind of gives you an example of how they combine their pictures to make different words or ideas and things like that. They also use writing to write on or engrave on bones. This is taken from the history of the ancient world, as is pretty much everything else that I use. But anyway, if you needed guidance on something, you would go to the Shang court and you would talk to the priest, and you would say, I need help with this thing that I'm trying to figure out in my life. The priest would bring out these cleaned and dried shoulder bones of a cow or sheep, and it was carved with inscriptions or had some kind of a pattern on it. They would then touch it with a heated metal point, and then once the bone got so hot it cracked, there would be a path through the bone, and that inscription was read and then interpreted. This was a sign from the ancestors, and then the priest would carve the results into bone. I think that's pretty interesting. Something else that's really interesting is the Royal Cemetery. So the Royal Cemetery is just north of Yin, again, the capital that finally stuck. Excuse me. There are these enormous pits that are dug into the ground, and it's just the exact opposite of Egyptian pyramids. The Egyptians were like, let's see how high we can go, whereas the Chinese were like, let's see how low we can go. Like Egypt, you can find human sacrifices in their tombs, I guess you would call them. However, they're not intact bodies like in Egypt, they're decapitated bodies. And you can thank me for not including any pictures. So what does this tell us about their culture? Well, you can assume, like in Egypt, that the kings had a lot of authority and they had a large enough labor force to compel this thing. Again, sorry I keep saying this, but you have to have a surplus. You have to have an economy that allows people to do these crazy things like build this huge pyramid or dig way deep into the ground for the king without having those people making food so people survived. Shang Dynasty ends with a man named Chao who was just so corrupt. He loved drinking, and because he wanted more money to drink and do stuff, he raised taxes. People don't like that. He made people do really strange things for his entertainment. He tortured people, he killed people, and people really hated him. So the end of the Shang Dynasty happens with the Zhao tribe to the west of the Shang capital. They are quietly putting together an army. The person who was putting together this army had been taken prisoner and arrested by Chao, and he had told him, please stop torturing people using this terrible method, because he was a very honorable, virtuous man. Again, we're seeing that pattern. And Chao was like, no. He ends up releasing him, and this guy puts together this army. Now, after he puts together an army, there's a battle between the 50,000 Zhao and the 700,000 palace soldiers. You see those numbers and you're like, of course the palace wins. However, when the palace soldiers meet with the Zhao soldiers, they're so fed up with the king that the Zhao reverse attack. So they're like, oh, I'm just going to go this way, and they attack their own army. They attack the palace, set on fire. Chao dies in that palace fire, and the Zhao dynasty begins with a virtuous man, like when the Xia dynasty ended in corruption and the Shang dynasty begins with Tang, who was a virtuous man. This is something we're going to refer to as the cycle. Susan Wise Bauer says, Chinese historians tell us that the right to rule based on no quality but of accidental birth slowly corrupted those who held it. Meaning, if you are just becoming king because you just happen to be born into that family, that will corrupt you. The Xia kings entered into a cycle which would repeat again and again throughout Chinese history. So we will see this again. The first kings of the dynasty earned their right to rule by their wisdom and virtue. They pass their rule to their sons, and as time goes on, those sons become lazy. Laziness becomes decadence, decadence becomes dissolution, and dissolution leads to a dynasty's fall. A new man, wise and powerful, takes the throne, a new dynasty rises, and the pattern repeats. At the end of each cycle, tyrants fall, and virtuous men return to the foundational principles, but they cannot hold these principles for long. Good faith deteriorates into mistrust, piety into superstition, refinement into pride, and hollow exhibition. For the way Sima Qian writes, who is China's historian, is a cycle. When it ends, it must begin over again. So that's the end of the Shang Dynasty. So we just covered 2 dynasties in like 20 minutes. So again, we just hit the high points. Hopefully, though, you understand more about ancient Chinese people's worldview, what they thought, what they believed, and what they valued. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.